This is KM Weiland, and you are listening to the 450th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I am unabashedly a summer girl, but I have to admit there's something really special about this time of year. And no, as an unabashed Christmas girl, I actually don't mean Christmas. I've gotten to where I love the gray days. They seem made for hunkering down with a warm cup of coffee, beautiful music, and getting lost in story worlds. I'm really excited that I'm going to get to start outlining this winter, probably around the first of the year, as soon as I finish up my preliminary edits for Dreambreaker before sending it on to betas. I like getting lost in a circle of light, curled up by the heater, writing away, or editing, as the case may be right now. I'm about half done with my edits and really hoping to finish within the month because, Christmas. Now, before getting down to business with today's podcast, I'm happy to get to say that this episode is sponsored by my favorite cover design company, Damonza. You've done it. You've finally written those two magic words, the end. But good writers know that ironically typing the end is just the beginning. Copy editing, formatting, cover design, marketing. If you want to get your book in front of eyes, the work has only just begun. With years of experience navigating those tricky next steps, Damonza.com has helped thousands of self-publishing authors do just that. Their award-winning team can design your cover, edit your manuscript, format your pages, and even create a feature film-worthy book trailer. In self-publishing, typing the end is never the end. So let Damonza.com give your book a professional level polish and gain access to a whole new world of readers. Right now, Damonza.com is offering Helping Writers Become Authors listeners a discount of 10% on any of their services. Just visit Damonza.com/authors. That's DAMONZA.com/authors and enter the promo code authors. That's 10% off cover design and more when you visit Damonza.com/authors and enter the promo code authors. And now I hope you enjoy today's topic, 10 rules for handling large casts of characters. Large casts of characters are the thing these days. Rowling, Martin, and Marvel, just to name a few newsworthy examples, victoriously, and sometimes not so victoriously, throw casts of hundreds at screen and paper. Understandably, writers rush to emulate, both because on a head level, this seems like the obvious path to success, and because on a heart level, we like these stories and instinctively want to recreate their enjoyable patterns. It sounds straightforward enough until you round up all your suspects in one room and try to organize their chaos of conversation. And multiple character dialogue sessions are the easy part. Once you start factoring in each character's personal contribution to plot and theme, the inside of your brain can end up looking like John Nash's secret shed. Recently on Facebook, Claire Lazon messaged me, "I'm writing a novel about a heist, and I have so many characters, 20 plus, involved in this heist that it becomes very difficult to deal with. Have you written an article describing how to tackle this problem? I can see it in my head as if watching a film, but putting it in writing is another story." Now, despite being a vocal proponent for small casts, I'll talk about that more in a sec, I tend toward relatively large casts of characters in my own stories. The just finished draft of Dreambreaker features nearly 70 named characters, almost all of whom appear repeatedly throughout the story. So today, let's talk about what I've learned over the years about managing large casts of characters and how you can employ a couple important rules of thumb to help you manage your own teaming call sheets. Rule number 1, characters should exist to represent theme and move plot, preferably both. The first and single most important principle to consider when evaluating the size of your cast is this: does each character matter to this story? Characters, like any element in a well-thought-out story, should never be throwaway additions. Each must contribute to the story. Sometimes this contribution may necessarily be as small as a few catalytic or informational lines in a one-off scene. But the more screen time characters have, the greater your responsibility to make sure they contribute to the story on a larger scale. It's not enough for prominent characters to exist in the story merely to move the plot. They must also influence and comment upon the thematic argument, either symbolically or by directly impacting the protagonist's personal arc of growth. Rule number 2, fewer characters are better. By extension of rule number 1, here's a truth some authors don't like to face. Fewer characters really are better. The tighter your cast, the tighter your story's focus in both its presentation of a forceful plot and its thematic argument. On a practical level, small casts aren't always possible. For example, you can't tell an epic story about multiple kingdoms at war without a cast of hundreds or even technically thousands. In these cases, you will need a substantive cast simply to convey the weight of the story's events. But even in these instances, it's almost always best to whittle the active cast down to a smaller handful that can represent the greater event happening in the background. So always ask yourself, what is the fewest number of primary characters necessary to tell this story to its optimum? Any more than that, and you risk clutter. Rule number 3, avoid repetition by recognizing which archetypes each character represents. Planning an optimally sized cast begins by recognizing the archetypal roles of characters within stories. Specifically, I'm talking about the broadest of all story archetypes: protagonist, antagonist, and relationship catalyst. Every single character in your story will, or should, represent one of these primal thematic forces. Then from there, we can expand the 3 primary story forces into a slightly broader exploration of the forces and perspectives that will fully flesh out your story's thematic argument, ensuring your plot is covering all its bases. These archetypes, based in large part on Dramatica's exploration, are number 1, protagonist, number 2, antagonist, number 3, sidekick, number 4, skeptic, number 5, guardian, number 6, contagonist, number 7, reason, number 8, emotion, and number 9, love interest or relationship character. These roles can overlap or be represented by multiple characters. However, in recognizing where you have 2 characters playing the same role, particularly when they consistently show up together in the same scenes, you can often tighten your cast by eliminating the repetition. Rule number 4, identify which characters play a role in the climax and prioritize them. Another way to determine whether your large cast is justified is by following all of your characters to the end of the story. What is their role in the climax? As the ultimate payoff of all foreshadowing in your story, the climax dictates what elements deserve a place in the previous acts. Characters who have no role in or impact upon the final climactic encounters are probably characters who are not strictly necessary to your story. On the other hand, those characters who do significantly play into the climax or the scenes leading directly up to it, these characters are ones you should be taking very good care of throughout the story. These are the characters who matter to your story. As such, they need to be properly developed throughout the story, preferably in all 3 acts. Even in situations where you're unable to give these characters a lot of screen time throughout, they should at least make an appearance and/or a sizable contribution in each act. Rule number 5, keep a firm grasp on which character is your protagonist. Now, one common pitfall with large casts of characters is losing the forest for the trees. However, the larger your cast, the more important it is to ground your story with a solid protagonist. This is the character with whom your readers will relate. This is the lighthouse in the storm. And more than that, the protagonist is the character who ultimately defines both the main conflict and the theme. If you are uncertain which character is your protagonist, look again to the climax, specifically the climactic moment. The protagonist is the character who initiates and or is most strongly impacted by the final resolution of the conflict and or represents the final thematic outcome. As such, this character needs to be given prominence throughout the story, specifically at the major structural moments. Even the largest cast can be grounded when placed within a solid structure that keeps its primary focus on the protagonist. Now, it's true, many prominent examples of large casts, including Martin and Marvel, aforementioned, don't really seem to follow this rule, although arguments can be made. In my opinion, their stories, despite their many good qualities, ultimately suffer as a result. Rowling, at least in the old days, is a stalwart exception whose clear protagonist, and thus thematic, through line perfectly grounds her mammoth casts. Rule number 6. Chart each prominent character's personal goal and personal conflict with the protagonist and every other pertinent character. Even after you've conscientiously examined and streamlined your cast down to its optimal fighting weight, you may very well still end up, as I often do, with a story that features dozens of prominent speaking roles. So, how do you manage them? Start by managing the characters' through lines. Remember, your minor character's most important distinguishing factor is their relation to the protagonist. It's not enough for minor characters to simply be present in the story, nominally either for or against the protagonist's goals. These characters should have distinct, concrete goals of their own. These goals should have a specific relationship to the protagonist's goals and, in turn, to every other pertinent character's goals. And naturally, you're always going to get a little extra honey on your bread if you're able to engineer a whiff of conflict even between allies. Understanding your minor character's goals is the single most important step you can take in making sure every character, no matter how many there are, contributes to the larger story rather than just being a benign space filler. Rule number 7, space out character introductions. Once you've got your cast planned and you're ready to get down and dirty with the actual writing, unique challenges emerge. One of the first has to do with how to introduce readers to so many characters. The rule of thumb is simple: space out introductions. Sometimes this takes planning. You will have to carefully engineer your early scenes to create plot-pertinent events that allow you to introduce as many important characters as early as possible with pertinent characteristic moments and without lumping them all together too quickly. There is no one right way to do this, but a good place to start is by making certain each character you introduce has a stake in moving their first scene forward in some way. A careful use of setting can also be useful. For example, if your story is about an army company, you can avoid introducing everyone right off the bat by separating them. Maybe in the beginning, the captain is in his tent with his adjutant. Then one of the soldiers comes in with a message before finally the captain goes out to talk to the rest of them. Rule number 8, lump similar characters together by characterizing them as a group and appointing a spokesperson. Sometimes casts end up being large not because every character is important, but because the group is important. For example, you can't tell a war story without huge armies. But every soldier in those armies need not be personally named or fleshed out. And even within smaller, more intimate groups, in which it is necessary to name many or all of the characters, such as our story about the captain and his company, it will often still be to your advantage to create groups and subgroups that can be either represented as a whole or represented by a spokesperson character. For example, instead of characterizing all 80 men in the captain's company, you could break it down into squads with sergeants and lieutenants representing their men. Rule number 9, know what each character wants and/or has at stake in each scene. Characters are no good to you if they aren't contributing to every scene in which they are present. If they aren't there to do something, then they're just in the way. Now, there are exceptions to this, obviously, such as large-scale events, such as weddings, which require supporting characters merely to observe. If you've done your homework, see Rule 6, then you already have a good idea what each character wants, and therefore what is at stake for each character in any particular scene. Now, you get to put that knowledge to work. Instead of a one-on-one argument between protagonist and antagonist, while side characters merely look on, now you have the opportunity for a complex representation of conflict and theme with every character invested in what's going on. And if it turns out a particular character really doesn't have anything to add to the scene's conflict and progression, well, it could be that person isn't necessary to this scene or the story after all. Rule number 10. Employ dialogue tags and action beats judiciously in multiple character conversations. And now we return to one of the most obvious challenges of large cast stories, multiple character conversations. So let's say you've pulled off the kind of scene we've talked about in the previous sections, a confrontation that involves not just the protagonist and antagonist, but every character present. How do you juggle all that dialogue without confusing readers? Frankly, it ain't always easy. But you can help readers avoid confusion by judiciously using dialogue tags, such as he said or she said. Action beats, such as she clenched the edge of the counter, are even better, since they also offer the opportunity to keep readers grounded in the setting and other sensory details. The more characters you have present in any scene, the trickier the choreography gets. But as long as you know exactly what role each character is playing, you will have a much better chance of keeping things as focused and powerful as possible. Stories with large casts of characters offer many challenges. Even the simplest story requires dozens of complex working parts, and the more characters you add, the more you exponentially increase your own challenges. However, when done well, large casts bring depth and heft to your story. So make sure you've considered the above rules, then gather your characters and start partying. And tell me what you think. Do you like to feature large casts of characters in your own stories? Why or why not? If you'd like to comment and be a part of the fabulous word player community over on my site, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast if you'd prefer to read, and also the place to add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on iTunes. And if you'd like to support Helping Writers Become Authors, I would totally appreciate it if you'd consider taking the time to leave a quick rating or review on iTunes. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.